European models. However, it acquired an architectural expression only with the Chicago School, and in particular with William Le Baron Jenney, whose studio was the launching pad for the Chicago School's architects. Amongst them, the greatest exponent was Louis Henry Sullivan. Here we see his famous auditorium in Chicago, built in 1886. The building reveals the influence that his great master, H. H. Richardson, still exerted upon Sullivan. To such a degree, says Zevi, that the auditorium might even be considered one of Richardson's greatest works. Here the hint of the Romanesque style is in the austere composition, of which Sullivan admits only the basic construction, the decoration being reduced to the bare essential. With this auditorium, American architecture finds itself for the first time 20 years ahead of Europe. The masterpiece of Sullivan is the store called Carson, Peary and Scott, a landmark that closes the old century and opens the new. Here, Sullivan overcame his earlier preconceptions of horizontality and verticality to achieve a perfect expression through the balance of vertical and horizontal lines. The structure is not hidden but exalted by the exceptional ornament that expresses Sullivan's original idea of organic architecture. Organic because it was dictated by Sullivan's principle, form follows function, which was to characterize an entire epoch, the functionalist epoch. And it is organic because of the decorative qualities which become poetry that integrates the poetry of the structure. Unfortunately, the generous efforts of Sullivan and the Chicago School were to be swept aside by the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, which was remembered by Wright as a tragic carnival, an overwhelming rise of grandomania by which every architect was captived. It was Frank Lloyd Wright who took over the glorious heritage left by Sullivan. Wright was a person with a difficult and misanthropic character, whose personality filled a great creative span, which was to be decisive for the modern movement. In spite of the great interest of the critics in Wright's work, it is still uncertain how much influence it may have had upon the formation of a modern architectural conscience. These are the apartments Wright built for Francisco Terrace at Oak Park, Chicago in 1895. Throughout his career, Wright, whose Hertley house we see here, made a constant effort to explain what he meant by organic architecture. In a lecture of 1940, Gideon tells us, Wright tried to explain with every possible means, but his efforts were in vain. In the end, it was clear that an explanation in words was not possible, and what he meant by organic architecture could only be revealed by his works. The last word, therefore, goes to the works that he has accomplished, to the concrete operative results that they contain, rather than to words, ideologies, and intentions. And this we should like to demonstrate. This is the Tomek house. Wright himself made the statement that architecture is to serve and glorify life. Thus, the architect's true task is that of interpreting our life, so that the building might give a greater contribution to this joy of living. Thus, the enclosed space, the interior, since it is destined for man's life, becomes the content, the essence, the leading character of Wright's architecture. The plan of the house is, therefore, no longer the result obtained from a pre-established volume in accordance with tradition, but the ultimate product of a conquest, that starting from a nucleus, for Wright generally the fireplace, projects the space in all those directions in which they who are to live in the house will want to move, act, and live, and not merely exist. In other words, the plan of the house must be the projection of all domestic functions. An excellent example is the Martin House at Buffalo that Wright built in 1904. Here the master eliminates every cellular segregation, lounge, dining room, study, and so on, that would box in the functions of living. He unites them in a single space, the living room. In this way, the architect creates that organic spatial continuity which is at the basis of the acts that are performed in the house. But this was not enough. Wright wanted to integrate the interior space with the surrounding reality and nature. To achieve this goal, he had not only to eliminate most of the inner walls, but to replace the outer walls with what Wright called shelter screens. By doing this, the architect let the room come through in a continuous window series. Then the inside and the outside began to relate, and participation in the life of nature could reach its perfect fulfillment. With Wright, the site and its environments began the irreplaceable and inalienable basis for any architectural design. This new planning method, whose main goal is the creation of interior spaces, cancels out all the problems concerning the so-called facade. The prospect of the building, in fact, becomes a direct consequence of the creative process of the inner spaces, that is to say, the exterior as a result of the interior. In other words, Wright inverts the process of planning. For example, a window is no longer created in order to promote an abstract beauty of the facade, but it is there and of that size because the architect wanted to light the interior space at that point and with that amount of light. The same applies to a door, a balcony, a porch, and so on. Naturally, Wright's approach to this was gradual, but it is possible to follow its process in a sequence of really exemplary works, the prairie houses, built between 1893 and 1910. Amongst these is the Thomas House, and the house of the architect, which was his own home. In these works, the master achieved such a typological, structural, and linguistic conquest that the critic Manson defined this period as the first golden age. Wright's first masterpiece, which also marks the start of his independent activity, is the Winslow House, built in 1893 at Oak Park. Here we can see the influence of Dear Master Sullivan, der liebe Meister, Wright called him, above all in the very refined decoration. The house still departs from a pre-established volume, from a box, as Wright defined it. However, the architect tries to break out of it at its rear, where he offers a singular assembly of volumes of different geometric forms. From now on, the destruction of the box becomes the main object of all Wright's research. To eliminate the effect of mass and volume in the Tomek house, for instance, the master destroys the corner and proposes a syntax of mere planes. At that time, nothing could be compared to these achievements in terms of spatial and volumetric creativity. Wright said, "In my works, I have tried to free the building from the walls, reducing them to a mere screen that, besides enclosing the space, brings the outside world indoors." In a constant relationship with the landscape in the Martin House, built in 1905, Wright emphasizes courageous dissonances in the joining of the various architectural elements of the construction. To the dogmas and absolutes of classicism, he opposes with asymmetry and tridimensional anti-perspectives. Here, the architect aims to exalt not only the horizontal line, but proposes strong contrast with the vertical elements. Note how the treatment of the corner makes any resemblance to box-like architecture disappear. Wright's great prerogative is the human dynamic use of the interior space with respect to the volume of the building and the harmonious relationship between these volumes and the landscape, as can be seen from the Frick House, also at Oak Park, built in 1902. Here, the master banishes any static element from the building and replaces the perspective effect that demands a single point of view with a three-dimensional anti-perspective, which implies movement around the building, that is to say, time to possess the work as a whole. From this comes the fourth-dimensional character of the building. Thus, the immobility of symmetry is replaced by the dynamism of asymmetry and static balance by articulated movement. The Frick House, also because of its plastering, assumes great importance as a source of inspiration for the Dutch movement, de stijl, together with Gale House. This movement, 15 years later, was to define the neo, or new plastic principle of the four-dimensional decomposition of the volume. That is to say, the disassembly of the box construction into mere planes and their consequent reassembly. In the Willits House, built in 1901, Wright introduces the cross plan, in which the fireplace becomes the nucleus, the hearth of the whole building. Thanks to the lateral porches, here the horizontal line is prolonged beyond the volume of the house itself. Wright used to say, "I see in the extended horizontal line the true horizon of life, the symbol of liberty." Also in the Roberts house, the fireplace becomes the heart of the home. Here, however, the horizontality of the Willits becomes a vertical continuum that achieves a spatial and volumetric unity through the living room, which is twice the height of the other rooms. "Among the houses that I have built," Wright said, "the most successful is Coonley House." A style of architecture for each style of person was one of his principles. Like Walt Whitman, his favorite poet, he drew strength from the faith of individuality and from the law of change. So his method could never be transmitted by mere formulas. In the Unitarian Temple, built in 1904 at Oak Park, Wright's prerogative of horizontality was suddenly muted. Here, the master seems to become reconciled with the classical register of the square form, which he assumes as a module for the whole building. Therefore, a square plan and an introvert structure, that is to say, closed to the outside. "The cube or square represents integrity," Wright said. "In my thoughts, the philosophy of the building took precedence over any other consideration." In the Unity Temple, The content and function of the building constituted the main planning motif. No liturgical apparatus, the message is left to the liturgy of words, and the architecture reflects it through its clean lines, free of any mystical attribute intended to distract the attention from worldly responsibilities. The philosophy of the Unitarians excludes any escape into transcendence, and the object of the temple is to induce reflection upon everyday life. Here, religious atmosphere is given by the light from above, filtered by a gigantic web of concrete beams and amber glass. The plan of the building is in the shape of an H, and the whole construction consists of 2 blocks which are joined by a huge room for meetings, Sunday school, feasts, etc. It is a long separated space to be subdivided on occasion by movable screens. It also acts as an entrance lobby to both blocks, and at the same time the connecting link between them. The rooms become the architecture of the outside, where the coherence is even greater. The cube of the temple, in fact, is not seen as an isolated block, since it is balanced by the smaller block for secular activities. From the exterior, the building appears broken up into simple volumes that the master reassembles in an articulated and harmonious Unitarian orchestration. Thus, he anticipates the early Cubist principles, and the structure becomes a plastic event in itself, even if inspired by Mayan motifs. The unity of the building is emphasized by the use of a single material, nude concrete, washed down and scraped, leaving the gravel visible on the surfaces. Show materials as they are is another of Wright's principles. Here is a perspective drawing, and as Wright would say, to go with the plans for the committee. The work which reaches the peak of maturity in the process of domestic architecture carried out by Wright in 20 years of research is the Roby House. It is the masterpiece which concludes and glorifies the theme of the prairie houses. The building rises out of an absolutely clean plan. The narrow plot of land, with the long frontage on the road, has induced the master to choose a single longitudinal axis. Terraces, walls, balconies, windows, all underline the act of liberation from the box prison. The volume of the building, once split up into slabs, is reassembled in such a way as to avoid any closed features and blocked corners. Volumetrically, it is a rich dictionary of plastic effects, numerous parts intersecting and penetrating each other to create a plurality of unexpected perspectives. The volumes of the construction no longer mark the division, but rather the mediation between the indoor and outdoor spaces. The building is supported by sturdy rectangular pillars placed at the corners. The daring cantilevered structures that leap out into space are anchored to the massive wall of the fireplace, once again confirming the heart of the house. The theory of the planes launched out into space is splendidly achieved in this masterpiece. It is at least a quarter of a century in advance of European architecture. As always, the most important aim of Wright's creative process is the enclosed space, which here becomes the product of an organic centrifugal growth of the house. The main body of the building, on the first floor, consists of a single space, the living room. Here, rather than studying the separate functions of the dwellers, Wright studies their circulation, their routes. In this way, the leading elements of the plan become lines of traffic, which eliminate every cellular segregation. The outside, boxing-in walls have here become shelter screens, or as Wright would call them, light screens, consisting of a continuous window series that brings the outdoors reality indoors and the inside world outside. Without a shadow of doubt, the Roby House represents a revolutionary organization of inner space.